Hi, boys and girls. Mrs. Ramage here. I hope you're doing well and are making the best of this situation when we're all stuck at home. I'm going to start reading to you the book Because of Winn, Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. This is a book that our fourth graders would be reading together at school this time of year. But since we can't be at school together right now, we're going to try it this way. I've never done this before, so please be patient with me and don't laugh too hard. You avid YouTubers out there are way better at this than me, but I'm going to give it a go. So here's the book, and in the packet of your new round of work, you have this packet. And if you're reading along with me, if you have your own copy of the book, or if you have an ebook of it, or you're just watching this video, or these series of videos, you will use this. The first 2 pages of the packet are just kind of like a pre-reading activity. The setting of this book is Florida. So the first one's just a Google search of the differences that you can find between the state of Florida and the state of Ohio. Same thing for the second page. If you look at this brown color, each chapter basically asks you to respond to one question. So for chapter 1, you're just going to actually make a prediction based on the title of the book. I'm going to read 3 chapters to you today in this video. You can pause the video in between each chapter and respond to your question. So take a look at this cover, thinking about what you predict the story will be about. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer, my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes. I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" he kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers, and there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile. That is what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all of his teeth, and then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked off some oranges off of a display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted was to get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big and maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And then I figured out that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world. that he would want to get called by a name, only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said. "Honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big, but skinny. You could see his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's go see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. "But you know what?" I told Winn-Dixie. "You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take you to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs, and I have to admit he stunk. Bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he would have to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie that he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweiler, little yappy Yorkie dog Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me, and while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. "Sit," I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. "Stay here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The preacher was sitting in the living room, working on the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which means he was thinking hard. "Daddy?" I said. He said back. "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his paper. "Well," I said, "I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." "Is that right?" he said. "Yes, sir," I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn Dixie! Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie. He looked at his ribs, his matted up fur, and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed some more, and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too. That's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked real soft to Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one. Chapter 3. I started in on Winn Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him good. I used my own hairbrush and worked real hard at all the knots and patches of fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can't hardly remember her, and I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're almost like orphans. Winn Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what? I said. Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard. More than I ever did when I was in Watley. Winn Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think Preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back. He doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn Dixie looked at me hard, like he was trying to say something. What? I said. He stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn Dixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing them with my toothbrush, and I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and so I took him into the trailer and showed him to the preacher. "Daddy," I said. He said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. "Daddy, I wanted to show you the new Winn Dixie." The preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. "Well," he said, smiling real big at Winn Dixie. "Well, now, don't you look handsome?" Winn Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head in the preacher's lap. "He smells nice, too," said the preacher. He rubbed Winn Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. "Daddy," I said real quick before I lost all my nerve, "I've been talking to Winn Dixie." "Is that right?" the preacher said. He scratched Winn Dixie's head. "I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things, that's all." The preacher stopped rubbing Winn Dixie's head and held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into his shell. "One for each year I've been alive," I told him. "Please?" Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to Winn Dixie, "I should have guessed you were going to be trouble." Then he looked at me. "Come on, Opal," he said. "Sit down, and I will tell you 10 things about your mama."